I want to start with a little bit of my own journey with AI. So it was literally 2 years ago. I started seeing more and more articles in like higher ed, different higher ed journals, newsletters, etc. Came back from our winter break and started to see more. And I wrote a blog post about it. I have a blog around career development, things of that nature, targeted mostly toward working professional students. Uh, and quickly I got outreach from people like, various professionals and um, uh, different platforms wanting to talk with me. And I was a little unprepared for that. And in the blog post, I talked about how I was going to, as a faculty member, start to use AI in my class so I could learn more about it because clearly it was something that was here to stay. I did that. That then shifted toward thinking about policy. Do we have policies in place? What does our conduct policy look like as it relates to AI? Which, of course, there was a gap. I was then asked to co-chair with our vice provost for undergraduate education, a very small committee to, in 6 weeks, draft a policy on AI use, particularly around use when it was deemed to be considered cheating or plagiarism, et cetera. We worked on uh, not only the policy itself, but helping faculty to understand what is AI, because we had faculty saying, oh, students can't use AI at all in my class. And then you're like, well, then they can't use Google. They can't use a smartwatch. They can, and you start listing the various things. Uh, they can't use just basic grammar, checkers. And they're like, oh, well, I didn't say that. I'm like, well, yes, you did. So we created, accompanying sort of guides to faculty on like what was completely created work, what was, sort of supported through AI, and what was completely generated through AI. That then, and the whole time I'm thinking about ethics. When should we use it? When shouldn't we use it? How should we use it, etc. And then I continued to transition or expand rather in my own personal journey on using AI for assessment in creating rubrics. I was teaching a brand new class with a bunch of brand new types of assignments. And I thought, oh my gosh, it takes me like a good hour and a half to create a really good new rubric. And I thought, I wonder if I could get AI to do it. And I did, and it was amazing. I mean, it took several iterations and, sort of tweaking of the prompts, but I was pretty impressed with the end result. And so I have this sort of progression that takes me from as a faculty member, but looks through not only the faculty lens from an educational, like how are we teaching students to use it, but the policy lens as well as the assessment lens. So with that, I'm going to really speak today about sort of policy implementation, potential impacts, as well as always the ethical considerations. And I just do see a question in the chat. I use ChatGPT, and I actually have a peer-reviewed journal article on it, which I can probably, when I'm done, can find the link and put it in the chat. Literally taking you step by step on creating the rubrics. So with that being said, schools do need policies to help both faculty, and yet I believe that most policies, including Drexel's, are geared towards student use of AI. It is not geared toward faculty use, and it is certainly not geared towards staff use, which I think is a huge gap and something we need to address, which I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And, because these are just so, if you're looking at a staff member, they are there to support the student learning, whether they are in assessment or they are in communications, it doesn't matter. Everything is tied to the student learning. So we have to think about it more holistically. Next slide, please, Devin. So let's talk about some of the policy considerations. And so I did break this out into four key areas: faculty, students, conduct, and then staff. And we'll talk about a little bit about why I sort of separated students and conduct in a second. But for faculty, again, I mentioned we created, accompanying documents to help faculty understand AI and what it truly is and how it can be used, uh, because some are very well acquainted with it. Uh, Others have not just haven't used it. They have a huge aversion. It's like they're going to implode if they use it. So they don't even want to learn anything about it. So there's everything on that very wide spectrum. But also, how are faculty using it in the classroom? One of the things that I decided from an ethical perspective, when I used AI to create those rubrics, on the bottom of that rubric, I have a statement noting that it was created with assistance of AI. I specifically said ChatGPT-3 on the date that I did it, because I wanted to model that for my students, because I gave them opportunities to use AI in the classroom in specific ways. And if I was going to ask them to acknowledge when they used it and cite it, then I needed to model it myself. So let's now look at from the student perspective. How are students using it? In my class last spring, I actually asked students, I did just a little poll, how do you use AI? About 40% said they weren't using it at all. And based on the assignment that I gave them specifically to use AI, I do believe that was probably fairly accurate. Some said they use it for everything, and others said they used it for more, uh, supportive measures, higher functioning, things of that nature. Others used it more for, critique purposes, editing, things of that nature. One of the things that we really talked about in terms of creating a policy, which again ties to conduct, is the fact that the AI detectors are still not accurate. They are often biased towards students for which English is not their first language. And at Drexel, we have a fairly large international student population at the grad level. And the last thing we wanted to do was to have a graduate, or whether grad or undergrad, but a talented or highly motivated student be accused of using AI when there was no possible way for them to prove that they didn't do it. And so at Drexel, a faculty member cannot simply say, well, through Turnitin or any of, the detection tools, it said that, student A used AI. And part of the reason for that, and I have not been able to find the subsequent article, but early on, I read an article in which a faculty member who was curious about this fed the Declaration of Independence into an AI detector, and it came back as 98% created by AI, which we know is not the case. So if it's saying that, I was like, we just have to be really careful. So to this day, faculty have to have a second, a second bit of evidence. And so I did have a student who I was pretty sure used AI, just from, if you use it enough, you start to see like how it structures, paragraphs, etc. It did come back through a detection tool, but then I also fed the prompt that I gave for the assignment I used ChatGPT, I think it was 3.5, and it came back with almost the exact same essay. So I spoke to the student, we talked about it. I still feel like we have to be a little bit careful in how we treat this from a conduct perspective, because we want students to continue to learn to use it, but we want them to use it ethically and responsibly and to understand the impact of using it and how it can detract from their learning experience, but also how it can enhance their learning experience. So I had a discussion with him and I gave him an opportunity to redo the assignment with no chat GPT, no, or any form of assistance in that way. And he redid the assignment and he actually did a great job. And I do not believe he used AI on the assignment. Uh, so again, I think we do have to think about the consequences for students, and I think we still need to remain in the educational sort of phase as opposed to the um, a punitive phase where it's just, okay, now you've got a plagiarism or a cheating, ding on your record. So finally, staff. I think this is the forgotten segment in higher ed when it comes to thinking about policy and use of AI. So I'm the chair of our assessment liaison committee at Drexel, and we're only just beginning to talk about AI, which just flabbergasts me. We've got a few of our assessment folks. Assessment is pretty decentralized at Drexel. We've got a few of our school assessment professionals using it pretty religiously. Others are just like, I wouldn't even know where to start. And I think that is potentially problematic when you think back to Bobby Joe's, crystal ball and her thoughts about how this is going to shift over time. And also you think to the statistics that Ruth showed. We need to be on top of this and we need to be playing with it and seeing what it can do and seeing what it can't do and looking at it continually through that ethical lens. There was the comment in the chat about the feeling of guilt. I think we have to step away from that. And one of the ways we do that is to be very open about using it and document our use of it and documenting what went well with it, what didn't go well with it, and so forth. So next slide, please, Devin. So some of the potential impacts. So for faculty, currently, there really are no boundaries to rely on or guidance for how to provide guidance to students. One faculty member will say, use it however you want to. Another faculty will simply continue to say, nope, you can't use it at all, but not really aware of what that means. There's inconsistent application of the technology, both from faculty and from students. And I'm typically not talking about the faculty who, are involved in creating these, large learning models and, none of our computer folks and, that. These are faculty who are using it, maybe they're social scientists, maybe they're, chemists, whatever, and they're using it in their classroom. And then there are inconsistent consequences by faculty, which promotes inequity, which we need to obviously be aware of. And for staff, again, there are no boundaries for staff either. I would bet if we surveyed all of you, and you come from a wide variety of different, different states, community college versus traditional 4-year versus R1s, etc. And I would bet we would get a different response from all of you in terms of whether or not you have a policy for students and faculty, whether you have one for staff, how it's used, if there are guidelines, boundaries, etc. And so for staff, there is the potential without this potential abuse of the technology. Of course, no one here would do that. We know that. But it can happen. And, again, I continually look through that ethical lens. When is it okay to have AI, write a report? That's not as what concerns me as much as, are we having staff who don't necessarily understand, embed data, student data, proprietary data, confidential data into a ChatGPT or Gemini, any of the platforms, not necessarily knowingly, and having that now become part of, the ethosphere, it's out there. and the potential for harm for that. So, staff and faculty too may not always have a good understanding of the tool and the potential impact. And for students, students are getting inconsistent use of the tool from one class to another. They can become very dependent upon, a tool to help them think about structuring an essay or about, helping them with their grammar. And then they get to another class and it's like, no, no, you can't do that. And that becomes really difficult for a student to navigate. Again, inequitable treatment, consequences that could have a big impact. And I would say this is true for faculty, staff, and students. There's nowhere to go. Now, we know Peter is taking on a larger role in his institution, and maybe there he will be that person to seek out for guidance. But, unlike um, roles where you go to, the dean of students when you're having a problem with your roommate, or you go to the dean of faculty affairs if you're not sure how to navigate something as a faculty member, or you go to HR as a staff member. There's no one across most universities who can answer these questions about AI consistently and provide guidance at our institutions. And again, I think it doesn't matter whether you're faculty, staff, or students, a lack of understanding of the tool and its impact can not only be challenging in terms of it could be reducing your workload, but it can have a negative impact or even present potential risk for the institution. Next slide, please, Devin. So again, the ethical considerations, I think we have an obligation as faculty to discuss the tools with our students, help them use it so that we can talk about the ethical considerations with them, when to use it, when not to use it, how to use it. And then we have to model that ethical usage and again, have teachable moments right now when it is used improperly as opposed to more punitive ones. The student that I mentioned before literally was weeks away from graduating. I was not going to stand in the way of the student graduating, but I did need him to learn the lesson at the same time. For staff, I think staff are often being left out of the conversation. The conversations are happening with faculty about pedagogy, about, how do we talk with students? How do we do the policy? And the staff are in the other room talking about something else because they're not being invited to the table, which I think is problematic. When is it okay to use AI for work as a staff member, for assessment, for report writing, etc.? I think universities need to think about this. And I loved, Ruth, your comment about if you do not have a policy, then create one for your team, for your department, and stick by it. I think, again, that's the whole point of modeling, model it if it's not there. It's really, really important, again, to think about that proprietary information and student data and ensuring that someone who may not know doesn't accidentally put it out there where, not only you've got student data out there, but you put the university at potential risk. And I think for students, I don't really have it here per se, but if we are not teaching them the ethics now, and we're not having these conversations, and it's inconsistent from one class to the next, and the treatment is inconsistent, what are we really teaching them for when they leave and they go into industry, or they go to graduate school, or wherever their journey takes them? If we're not having those conversations now, I can guarantee they are probably not having them within the industry. It's like, do it as quickly as you can get it done, however you can get it done. Now, there may be some proprietary discussions. There may be an internal paid platform so that there is no risk of that getting out of, privacy, data, et cetera, getting out there. But it's important to have those conversations. Next slide, please. And so for my crystal ball, I think policy is really, really important. It's an integral part of AI. But there really have to be two policies. One for academic usage, which will apply to students and faculty, and then another for standard use by staff, which may also apply to faculty as well. We have to provide guidance. If we don't provide guidance, we're just opening the floodgates, and it's kind of a create your own adventure. And that is going to result in ethical risk. It's going to result in potential lawsuits. It's going to result in people's taking a step backward and saying, oh, I don't want to do this because like I made a mistake before and no one told me what to do and not to do. And so then the learning stops. And that can hinder their career, that can hinder their professional development. So we also need to provide those boundaries, especially around policy and privacy and proprietary information. Without it, we're going to end up being behind the eight ball, because certainly some institutions are going to jump on this. They're going to do it right from the get-go. Those that don't are going to find that their assessment, their reporting, anything that they use AI for, or that AI could be used for, they're going to fall behind on. And, I think we're going to see, to Bobby Joe's point, some assessment positions are going to go away, which means, not too long down the road, Drexel's part of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, our accreditor. These accreditors are going to shift and change. And if we're not changing and reacting now, being proactive, we're going to have to be reactionary down the road. And that's never a good place to be, whether it's assessment or it's teaching or policy creation, etc.